In the dust and endless sky of rural Montana, where opportunity is measured in acres and tradition runs deeper than roots, Sarah made a choice that nobody saw coming. She walked away from everything a woman in her position was supposed to want. At 28 years old, with a wealthy rancher on one knee and a diamond ring that cost more than most people earn in a year, she said no. Not because she didn't love him, not because the life he offered wasn't beautiful, but because she finally understood that real freedom doesn't come with a price tag, and real love shouldn't ask you to disappear. What happened next teaches us something profound about the cost of compromise and the unexpected ways the universe rewards those brave enough to choose themselves. This is the story of Sarah, the gold she refused, and the cowboy who taught her that sometimes the greatest treasures can't be bought. Sarah Catherine Mitchell grew up in the kind of small Montana town where everyone knows everything about everyone, and there is no such thing as a private life. Her father, Robert Mitchell, was a successful cattle rancher whose family had owned land in the Gallatin Valley for 3 generations. Money was never a problem in her childhood. There were always fine things, quality education, and opportunities that many rural children could only dream about. Yet somehow, despite all of this comfort and security, Sarah felt something missing. It was the kind of emptiness that good grades and new horses couldn't fill. She was restless in the way only intelligent, spirited young people can be. Her mother, Catherine, had been a schoolteacher before she married. She gave up her career when Sarah was born, as was expected of women in their community during that time. Sarah watched her mother with careful eyes as she grew older. She saw how her mother would speak about the books she loved, about the students she'd taught, about the plans she'd had before she became a wife and manager of a household. There was a wistfulness in her mother's voice on certain evenings when she looked out the window toward the distant mountains, as if she were trying to remember who she was before she became someone's wife. "Don't make the choices I made just because they're expected," her mother told her when Sarah was 16. It was one of the few direct conversations they ever had about such things. Make choices because they're yours. Sarah never forgot those words. They lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. By the time she finished high school, Sarah was clear about one thing. She wouldn't stay in her hometown. She applied to universities in different states, dreaming of studying environmental science and maybe working in conservation. She had a genuine passion for it. She spent hours reading about ecosystems, about the delicate balance of nature, about how human beings could live in harmony with the land instead of just taking from it. Her father smiled at her ambitions the way you smile at a child's drawing. He didn't believe she would actually go through with it. He assumed she would eventually settle down and accept the natural order of things, that is, the order he believed was natural. Sarah left for the University of Colorado anyway. For 3.5 years, she lived a life that felt completely her own. She made friends from all over the country. She went to concerts and protest rallies. She stayed up late debating philosophy and the future of the planet. She cut her long hair short because she wanted to, not because anyone expected her to keep it long. It was the happiest she had ever been because it was genuinely, authentically hers. Then her father had a heart attack. It was not immediately fatal, but it was serious enough that he required months of recovery. Her mother's voice on the phone was thin and frightened when she called Sarah at her dormitory. "He's asking for you," her mother said. "He keeps saying he needs to talk to you about something important." Sarah packed up her apartment mid-semester and drove back to Montana. The road home felt shorter than she remembered, but also longer, as if time itself was stretching. She didn't realize, consciously, that she was driving back towards something larger than her father's recovery. She was driving back into a gravitational field that had been pulling at her since the day she left. Her father recovered, slowly and stubbornly. He was not a man who accepted limitations. During his recovery, he talked to Sarah about the future of the ranch. The cattle industry was changing. They needed to modernize, to think bigger, to adapt to new challenges. He needed her to come home, he said. He needed her to use that education she'd gotten and help him run the operation. He needed her to be practical about her life. Sarah couldn't say no to a man who had just survived a heart attack. She deferred her final year of studies. She came home to help her father through his recovery and to learn the business. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would go back and finish her degree. She never did. 2 years passed in the familiar rhythms of ranch life. Sarah threw herself into the work with genuine intensity. She implemented new irrigation systems based on what she'd learned about water conservation. She started a rotational grazing program that improved the soil health of the pastures. She documented the wildlife that lived on their land. In some ways, she was doing the conservation work she'd always dreamed about, just in a different form. She was able to almost convince herself that this was okay, that this was enough. Then Daniel Whitmore came to the valley. Daniel was in his early 30s, successful, and from one of the oldest ranching families in the region. His father and Sarah's father were old friends. Daniel had studied business at an Ivy League university and had come back to Montana with plans to expand his family's operation into something much larger. He was handsome in the way that Western men often are, weathered and real, not polished or artificial. He wore his success like he wore his cowboy hat, naturally, without needing to mention it. He met Sarah at a ranching convention in Missoula. The story was simple and traditional. He was drawn to her intelligence and her beauty, and she was drawn to his ambition and his confidence. They started dating, and for a while, it felt right. Daniel understood the world she came from. He didn't think her conservation ideas were strange or impractical. He listened when she talked about environmental protection. He seemed to see her. For 18 months, they built something that looked very much like a fairy tale. Daniel was patient and kind. He never pressured her. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and her plans. When he proposed on a clear September evening at sunset, standing in a meadow on the edge of his property, Sarah almost said yes immediately. Almost! She took the ring. She said she needed to think about it. Daniel thought this was endearing. He thought it was just her careful nature asserting itself. He didn't understand that Sarah was feeling something far more complicated stirring beneath the surface. For 3 days, Sarah wore the diamond ring and felt like she was drowning. She walked through the ranch in the early mornings, when nobody else was awake. She thought about her mother looking out the window at the mountains. She thought about her conversation with her mother at 16. Make choices, because they're yours. She thought about who she was when she was 21, living in Colorado, believing that her life belonged to her. Daniel wanted to marry her in the spring. He wanted to build a house on his property. He wanted children. These were all things Sarah thought she wanted too, in that abstract way that people plan futures. But standing on the edge of those plans, she suddenly understood the difference between wanting something and choosing it freely. Daniel was a good man. That was part of what made it so hard. Sarah loved him, but she wasn't sure that she was marrying him, or marrying the idea of becoming the person a woman was supposed to be. She loved him, but she realized that she had been disappearing inch by inch since she came back to Montana. She had been teaching herself to make smaller desires, to accept smaller versions of herself, to be the woman that everyone needed her to be. The night before she finally talked to Daniel, Sarah sat alone in the barn and wept. She wept because she did love him. She wept because she knew what she was about to do to him, and to her family, and to the carefully ordered world that everyone expected her to occupy. She wept because choosing yourself sometimes means breaking other people's hearts, and there is no way around that hard, painful truth. The next evening, Sarah drove to Daniel's house. She wore the diamond ring. She had prepared 1,000 explanations and apologies. In the end, when she sat across from him in his living room, none of them seemed right. "I can't marry you," she said, her voice shaking. "And I can't keep living like I'm living. I'm not choosing myself, and I'm not choosing you properly. I'm just choosing what's expected, and that's not fair to either of us." Daniel was shocked. He tried to convince her that she was confused, that post-engagement jitters were normal, that they could work through whatever was troubling her. He was a problem solver, and this was a problem he was certain could be fixed with the right conversation, the right reassurance, the right commitment. Sarah listened to him with love and sadness, and she remained firm. She drove home that night without the diamond ring. She returned it the next day with a handwritten letter that took 3 hours to compose and 2 hours to deliver because she kept stopping to cry. When she arrived home, her parents were waiting for her. They had already heard from Daniel and from his parents. The looks on their faces told her that she had just committed a kind of social sin. Her father said very little. Her mother cried, not from anger but from something more complex. Possibly recognition, possibly regret, possibly love for the daughter who was choosing something she herself never had. "I'm leaving," Sarah told them that night. "I'm finishing my degree. I'm going to do the work I actually want to do." Her father said, "You'll come back. You'll understand that you've made a mistake." Sarah wasn't sure if he was right or not, but for the first time in years, she felt like she could actually breathe. Part 2. Sarah's return to university was strange and disorienting in ways she hadn't anticipated. At 28, she was older than most of her classmates, and that age difference felt like standing in a different room. Even when she was sitting in the same lecture hall, the younger students seemed caught in a different dimension of time, where the future felt infinite and their choices seemed to matter less. Sarah knew better now. She had felt the weight of choices deferred, of compromises made in silence, of paths not taken. She finished her degree in environmental science, graduating with a thesis on sustainable land management practices in the American West. Her research was thorough and thoughtful. She interviewed ranchers, conservationists, government officials, and tribal leaders. She was driven by a genuine desire to find solutions that didn't require choosing between economic viability and environmental protection. It was the kind of nuanced thinking that few people brought to these conversations, where positions were usually polarized and defensive. During her final year of study, Sarah landed an internship with a non-profit conservation organization based in Missoula. The work was sometimes frustrating. Bureaucracy and funding limitations and the slow pace of actual change. But it was meaningful. She was doing something real. She was building a life that was actually hers. When she graduated, the organization offered her a position. It didn't pay well, but it paid enough. She found an apartment in Missoula, a small place with big windows and a view of the mountains. She furnished it slowly, choosing each piece with intention. There was something deeply satisfying about building a life this way, deliberately and consciously, instead of letting default settings make the decisions for her. Back in her hometown, the story of Sarah Mitchell had already become legend. She was the woman who rejected a perfect marriage for a foolish dream. She was pitied by some and condemned by others. The gossip was inventive and often cruel. She learned this through her mother's careful, gentle updates. Her mother was always the messenger, always trying to soften the judgment of the community. Sarah didn't pretend that none of it hurt. It did. It hurt to be misunderstood. It hurt to disappoint people she loved. It hurt to be viewed as selfish or foolish. But she had learned something through her years of compromise, and that something was worth the pain of standing apart. The only life worth living is the one you actually choose. Her relationship with her father remained strained for 2 years after she left. He sent her money, which she didn't ask for and didn't want. She sent it back. This became a pattern of small resistance. He was trying to solve her problem with money, as if her unhappiness could be remedied with the same practical solutions he applied to everything else in his life. Her mother drove to Missoula to visit her on Sarah's 29th birthday. They sat in Sarah's small apartment, and her mother looked around with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, she said, "You look happy, genuinely happy." "I am," Sarah said. Her mother nodded slowly. "Your father will eventually understand," she said. "He's a stubborn man, but he's not an evil one. He made his choices in a different time, with different expectations. He's trying to make sure you have security because he thinks security is the same as happiness. He hasn't learned yet that they're different things." Over the next few years, Sarah built a quiet life of genuine satisfaction. Her work took her all over Montana and into Wyoming and Idaho. She worked with ranchers to implement conservation strategies. She did field research on wildlife corridors and water resources. She wrote articles and gave presentations. She was respected for her expertise and her thoughtfulness. She dated, but not seriously. She had learned something important about herself through the Daniel experience. She had to be very careful about relationships, because she had a tendency to shrink herself to fit into them. She was learning to be alone in a way that was healthy, learning to know herself outside of the context of being someone's daughter or someone's potential wife. In her 32nd year, Sarah was asked to present her research at a conference in Jackson Hole. The presentation went well. She received genuine interest from other professionals in the field. An older woman from the University of Montana approached her afterward and said, "You have a real gift for this work. You see the whole picture. Have you thought about pursuing a master's degree?" Sarah hadn't. She had been so focused on simply being able to do this work, on having the freedom to do it, that she hadn't thought about going deeper. But the suggestion planted something, a seed of possibility. It was at dinner that evening, at a restaurant overlooking the Tetons, that she ran into him. James Coulter was a rancher from northeastern Montana, not far from where Sarah had grown up. They knew each other in that vague way that people from small communities know each other. They had crossed paths at various events, but had never actually had a real conversation. He was there with friends, and they happened to end up at the bar while Sarah was waiting for a table. They made eye contact, and he smiled with genuine recognition and warmth. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, approaching her. "I thought that was you. It's been years." They talked for what turned into 2 hours. James had taken over his father's ranch, but he was doing things differently. He'd gone back to school, studied sustainable agriculture. He was implementing rotational grazing and water conservation practices similar to what Sarah had pioneered on her father's land. They discovered that they had much to talk about. More importantly, they discovered that they enjoyed the conversation for its own sake. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said finally. "Just the two of us. I'm in Missoula twice a month for work. Would you have coffee with me next time I'm in town?" Sarah said yes, but with caution. She was wary of her own tendency to fall into things, to let relationships define her. But there was something different about James. He didn't seem to need her to be anything other than who she was. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. He seemed to have his own full life, his own projects and goals, and he wasn't looking for her to complete him. They started seeing each other, and it was different from her relationship with Daniel. There was no rush. There was no sense that they needed to follow a predetermined script. They were two people who actually enjoyed each other's company, and who had enough distance and independence that they could make choices freely. But Sarah was still careful. She was still watching for the moment when she might start to disappear, when she might start to reshape herself to fit into his expectations. She was waiting for the version of herself that she had given away so easily before. That version never came out. After a year of dating, James did propose. But he proposed differently than Daniel had. He asked her not in a moment of romantic theatre, but in a conversation about their future. He said, "I know you were hurt once, and I know you've been protecting yourself. I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly who you are. I'm asking if you want to build a life with me, knowing that you can keep doing your work, keep your independence, keep being yourself." Sarah wept when he said this, but they were different tears than before. They were tears of recognition, the recognition that it was possible to love someone and not lose yourself, that it was possible to build something with another person without erasing who you were. This time, when she said yes, she knew she was choosing freely. Part 3. The wedding was small and unconventional. Nothing like the grand affair that had been planned in the fantasy version of Sarah's life. They married in a meadow on the edge of James's property, with just 40 people present, family and close friends. Sarah wore a simple cream-colored dress that she had chosen because she liked the way it looked on her, not because it matched some imagined version of what a bride should wear. James wore his good jeans and a button-down shirt that his mother had insisted he iron. They wrote their own vows, and Sarah's included the words, "I choose you while remaining myself. I promise to love you while protecting my own freedom. I promise to build something with you that doesn't require either of us to disappear." Her father heard about the wedding from her mother. He did not attend. This still hurt, but it hurt differently now. Sarah had made peace with the fact that some people, even people you love, might not approve of your choices. She had learned that she could live with their disappointment. What surprised her was a letter that arrived 3 weeks after the wedding. Her father's handwriting was shaky on the envelope. Inside, he had written 2 pages. He didn't apologize exactly, but he explained. He said that he had made certain choices for her because he believed they were the right choices, and he had believed that love meant protecting people from their own mistakes. He had realized, through the example of her mother's quiet unhappiness, that protection can sometimes be a cage. He said that watching his heart attack and his daughter's refusal to marry Daniel had forced him to reconsider what legacy he actually wanted to leave behind. The letter ended, "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I always have been, even when I didn't know how to say it in a way that you could accept. I would like to know my son-in-law. I would like to hear about your work. If you're willing, I would like to find a way forward." Sarah showed the letter to James, and they drove to Montana the next weekend. Her father was waiting on the porch of the house where she had grown up. He was older than she remembered somehow. Or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly, with the perspective of an adult who understood that her father was just a person doing his best, like everyone else. They had dinner together, her parents and Sarah and James. Her father asked questions about the ranch, about James's practices, about the conservation work. He didn't completely understand Sarah's choices. She wasn't sure he ever would, but he was trying. That was what mattered. Over the next 2 years, Sarah and James built a life together that was rich and complex and genuinely theirs. They didn't have children immediately, though they talked about maybe having them eventually. Sarah finished her master's degree while working full-time. James expanded his ranch sustainably, implementing changes that actually improved both the land and the bottom line. They spent weekends hiking and reading and having conversations that ranged across philosophy, science, politics, and personal dreams. Sarah's work began to gain recognition. She was invited to give presentations at major universities. She published research that was cited in conservation discussions across the region. She was building something real, something that would outlast her, something that mattered. One afternoon, 2 years into their marriage, Sarah was working on a conservation project in her home county, just miles from where she had grown up. The project involved working with several ranchers to create a wildlife corridor that would protect migration routes for elk and mule deer. One of the ranchers involved was her father's. She went to meet with him to discuss the implementation. He was in the barn doing something to the irrigation system. He was 72 years old now, and age was showing in the way he moved more deliberately than before. "Your project is good," he said as they stood looking out at the pastures. "It's what you've always believed in." "It's what I still believe in," Sarah said. He nodded. "I'm not going to live forever," he said bluntly. "Another few years maybe, if I'm lucky. I want the ranch to mean something after I'm gone. I want it to be a place where people work with the land instead of just taking from it. That's what I want people to remember me for. Will you help me with that?" Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This was, she realized, her father's way of saying that she had been right. That the values she had insisted on, the choices she had fought for, the path she had refused to abandon, all of it had been worth it. "Yes," she said, "I'll help you with that." In her 35th year, Sarah became the director of a new non-profit that her father funded. The organization worked with ranchers across Montana to implement sustainable practices. It was a marriage of her father's resources and her vision. It was, in many ways, a solution that neither of them could have created alone. But it was possible because she had refused to abandon her vision, and because her father had eventually learned that real love sometimes means accepting the choices of the people you love, even when they're not the choices you would make. Her mother told her on a quiet afternoon when they were having tea together, "I'm so glad you didn't marry Daniel." "Because you would have been me," her mother said simply. "You would have looked out the window at the mountains and wondered about the life you could have lived. I didn't want that for you. And I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to choose differently." Sarah and James eventually did have children, 2 daughters and a son. Sarah raised them with a very different philosophy than she had been raised with. She told them, from the time they were young, that their lives belonged to them. She told them that love should never require them to disappear. She told them that the greatest gift they could give themselves and the world was to become authentically, courageously, genuinely themselves. The gold that Daniel offered Sarah would have been beautiful. It would have brought security and comfort and social acceptance. But it would have cost her something far more valuable, the ability to wake up every morning knowing that her life was truly hers. Years later, when Sarah was in her 50s, she ran into Daniel at a conference in Helena. He was married now with 2 children of his own. He seemed happy, genuinely happy. He smiled when he saw her, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of accepting recognition. "I never properly thanked you," he said. "For what?" Sarah asked, surprised. "For being honest with me," he said. "For not marrying me out of obligation or security or fear. If you had, neither of us would have gotten to be happy. I would have built a life with someone I loved, but someone who wasn't completely there. And you would have slowly disappeared. Neither of those things would have been right." Sarah felt tears forming, which still happened when she encountered real wisdom about her own choices. She thought about the 18-year-old version of herself, the one who cut her hair short and moved to Colorado to chase a dream. She thought about the 28-year-old version, sitting in a barn and weeping about the choice she had to make. She thought about the version that said no when the world expected her to say yes, and the courage it had taken to do that. The gold had never been the real treasure. The real treasure had always been freedom. The freedom to choose herself, to build her own life, to become who she was meant to be. And once she had claimed that freedom, everything else, including genuine love, had become possible. Sarah had learned that refusing gold and declaring your own freedom isn't about rejecting security or relationships or love. It's about insisting that those things only matter if they're freely chosen, if they're authentic, if they allow you to remain whole and genuinely yourself. In the end, that insistence on authenticity and freedom had brought her something that no amount of wealth or social approval could have purchased, a life that was undeniably, completely courageously her own.